So definitely the main thing that makes LATAM and Mexico so exciting for these companies is the amount of growth that you can have. The amount of rides and growth you can have in cities where ride
Hmm.
sharing is not present is substantial. There's definitely still room to grow, especially when you consider that in almost all of the cities, almost 40% of the market share is owned by another company.
Jose Carlos Aguilar is currently Director of Operations for MI NAVE, part of the Voyager Global Mobility, which owns Buggy, U-Cars, Fast Track, among others. He spent 3 years at Didi, where he had a few different roles. He started as Regulatory Operations Manager, in charge of regulatory compliance and operations on both state and federal level. He then moved to Launch and Small City Territory Lead, in charge of 26 cities in Mexico and all of their new launches. And then he ended his time there in Mature Cities as the Territory Lead, in charge of all the big cities in Mexico. He also did his undergrad from UNC Chapel Hill in finance and a double grad MBA from IPADE Business School in Mexico and IESE Business School in Barcelona, Spain. Wow, all over the place. Charlie, how are you doing today?
Hello, Harry. Nice. Thanks for having me, and very excited to have a chat
Yeah,
about ride hailing in Latam.
it sounds like you almost might be the rideshare guy of LATAM. Is that a good way to put it, huh?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, mainly my experience has been in Mexico, obviously, but given that I was in Didi, I was able to get a picture as well of how the whole Latam market is doing.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I'm really excited to have you on for two reasons today. I really want to learn about Mexico and the LATAM market when it comes to the ride hail dynamics. Obviously, we're all familiar with Uber. They're the global company doing millions of trips per day in the United States. It's Uber versus Lyft. And, I think the volume that we see here, sometimes we forget that there are some really large players outside the United States, like Didi, like the company that you worked for. And especially too, I think they're, back in the day, they were in the fundraising cycle, when it was Uber versus Didi in China. And now it's not so much, at least in the US, it doesn't seem like it's Uber versus Didi, but, it sounds like in LATAM that might be a little different. So why don't you set the scene a little bit for us? Like, who are the big players in LATAM these days in the rideshare market and, sort of what's going on? Like, what might not someone in the US know?
Yeah, so definitely the biggest difference between the US and the rest of Latam is definitely Didi. Didi,
Hmm.
Didi is without a doubt the second biggest ride sharing company in the world.
Hmm.
And that means a heavy amount of investment whenever they try to operate in a country or a city.
Hmm.
I mean, what Didi arrived in Mexico around 6 years ago, and when
Yeah.
it arrived in Mexico, it came with a very, very aggressive investment proposal in order to gain market share from Uber.
Hmm.
I don't know if people have heard the stories of how the app war in China was between Uber and Didi, but it
Yeah.
was very intense. And some of that intensity has translated to Latin America as well,
Hmm.
where both players are investing heavily. And this has resulted in good news for the drivers because at the end of the day, whenever there's a big push from companies for market share, that is good news for driver earnings as well.
Gotcha. So right now it seems like in LATAM there are two big ones, Uber and Didi. Are they about 50-50? In Mexico, is it maybe a little different? What's sort of the high level?
In Mexico, as a country as a whole, I would say it's very, I mean, I'm not going to give you the exact percentages, but it's
Sure.
almost 50-50. It's
Got it.
like, yeah, it's compared to what you guys have in the US with
Hmm.
Uber and Lyft, with Uber winning the market so far. Here right now, it's extremely tight, extremely close battle between the two.
Got it. So when I visited Mexico City, I've gone a couple times now, and I think maybe the first time I went, which oh man, was maybe 7 or 8 years, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I want to say. I remember that, I had a few friends who lived in Mexico City and they owned a brewery. They were very hip, drinking mezcal, and I feel like it was very cool to take an Uber when I went about 6, 7, 8 years ago. What's the sort of like intangible feeling about Uber versus Didi? What's the reputation? What are sort of, people talking about? Like here, I would sort of say that, like in the US, most customers kind of like opt for an Uber, like they're kind of the more reliable, they're the go-to. A lot of times they say, oh, let's get an Uber, even when they mean a Lyft. What are the sort of, what's kind of like the sentiment among customers in, Mexico?
No, Oh, here I think the first mover advantage of Uber in
Hmm.
Mexico obviously is still present.
Yeah.
We still say the same thing in Mexico. I'm gonna get an Uber instead, and you order a Didi.
Yeah.
It could happen. It's very common here. Usually, the way people see it here is obviously public transportation in Mexico. It's not very good
Hmm. Mm.
compared to very other cities in the States. So ride sharing is obviously one of the main ways that people move around the city, especially in Mexico City. And yeah, both companies go at it for passengers. I would say for Uber, it's more about its brand presence.
Hmm.
And for Didi, it's more they want to have that image of value for money. So we're going to be cheaper. You might not get the better ETA, but at the end
Hmm.
of the day, we want to for better value for money than itself.
Got it. Well, why is LATAM such an important market? I think we hear that, there's a lot of investment flowing into these areas. It sounds like it's pretty competitive. Well, you mentioned 6 years ago, right, when Didi came in, and, it seems like a big battle. They're investing a lot of resources. Is it purely there's millions of rides happening? I mean, I'm imagining the average order value of each of these rides, is lower in LATAM versus, in the United States where it might be $20, $25. So what are some of the sort of on the ground, like KPIs or metrics or, what makes this market so exciting to people?
So definitely the main thing that makes LATAM and Mexico so exciting for these companies is the amount of growth that you can have on transactions and users. As you
Hmm.
say, the ticket value is not that great compared to the US, but the amount of rides and growth you can have in cities where ride
Hmm.
sharing is not present is substantial. So you can see some growth curves that are ridiculous. I mean, you can get a city that in 1, 2 months after you launch, you're getting
Hmm.
200K trips a week. So it's that
Got it.
intense.
So do you think there's still a lot of growth potential left, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I think most of the major cities in Mexico have now been launched. I would say
Hmm.
almost the same in the US, in the rest of Latin America, sorry.
Yeah.
But there's definitely still room to grow, especially when you consider that in almost all of the cities, almost 50, 40% of the market share is owned by another company.
Got it. So you think there's still room to grow as far as the number of trips? Do you think there's opportunity to increase the ticket value?
I think there is, but also you have to consider that at the end, the purchasing power
Hmm.
of here in Latin America is much lower than
Got
in the
it.
US. So I would say, yes, there is a chance to increase prices still,
Hmm.
but I don't see that way as the main growth for GMV for both companies.
What do you think about the profitability of the rideshare model in LATAM versus the US? I kind of made this, I don't know if it was a joke, but I made this observation. Like I'm no expert when it comes to financials, but I feel like right now in the United States, Uber is at its peak kind of pricing power. They're charging riders more than they've ever charged, and riders don't have alternatives, so they have to pay it. Like they're at the bar, they go to the airport, they got to get home, they'll pay whatever it costs. There's no alternatives, right? And then drivers on the supply side, there's a lot of drivers. Dara has been talking about on the earnings calls. We have more drivers than ever. Drivers are coming to me complaining there's too many drivers, right? So they can obviously pay them less. And Uber has released data that, the average hourly earnings of drivers is going down, right? Which makes sense. And I just feel like, like last quarter, they had a big write down of, basically like equity, but they still, even without that, made, 50, 60, $70 million. And, I feel like they're at like peak pricing power in the US. They have more drivers than ever. Like, I feel like they should be making a ton of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And I know there's a lot going on because they've got the mobility business and they've got the kind of ride, the eats business, and they've got international, which might have different dynamics. But how do you think about the profitability in the sort of US versus LATAM markets for
I
rideshare?
think this is my view of these two companies. Ride hailing is definitely the golden egg
Yeah.
of the portfolio of everything they have. It's profitable,
Yeah.
and it's so profitable that it maintains the other business verticals of the
Yeah.
business. So delivery, whatever else they're trying with scooters or whatever you
Yeah.
can think of, the cash cow of the business is
Yeah.
always and has been ride hailing. So yes,
Yeah.
it is profitable. I've seen the take rates and the prices in the US for both Uber and Lyft,
Hmm.
and I can guarantee you, from what I see from the
Yeah.
outside, it looks like they're very profitable.
Got it. Well, so how do the take rates in LATAM compare, for example? Can they potentially charge a higher take rate, or well, what are the sort you see there?
See, so for take rate, I think it's a perfect example of how competition drives the push for better earnings for drivers.
Hmm.
So there's a golden rule in ride hailing that says the less market share you have in a city, the more you
Hmm.
have to invest on.
Hmm.
And when I mean investing is driver incentives, tax discounts,
Yeah.
et cetera, and take. Whenever you're in a situation where you're head to head with another company, both companies are going to invest heavily. And that is
Hmm.
translated into the take rates of both Uber and Didi here in Mexico. The best example I can give you is on April, both companies offered a guaranteed take rate of 20%,
Hmm.
which is kind of crazy compared to what I've seen in the US, where I've seen Lyft last year offered 30%. And from what I've seen from other drivers in the
Yeah.
US, they tell me their average take rate is between 30 and 40%.
Yeah.
So here
Well,
in Mexico, the average take rate per
yeah.
trip it's between 15 and 20%. So it's that
Got it.
aggressive.
And I guess you sort of have to define take rate, right? So to me, I think of take rate as passenger pays $10, driver keeps $8, company keeps $2, right? Lyft, for example, they sort of rolled out, oh, we'll guarantee we keep 70% after insurance and fees, and so it's sort of like, okay, start at 10, we're going to take $5 in insurance and fees, and then we guarantee you 70% of the remaining $5. So the actual take rate, could be 60%, right? So it's sort of like, I guess to me, like I always keep things simple, but are you saying that take rate might be that actual 20%?
It's the actual 20% of what
Actual
the passenger
20%.
pays, and then you
Interesting.
have to discount taxes.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's no way to get rid of that. But
Got
yes,
it.
it's the actual price that
Inter-
the
you know,
passenger
I think
pays.
that's a good point. I think that you're right there. That 50-50 competition, we haven't seen that in the United States really in a long time. And if anything, it's trending very slowly in the other direction, right? With Lyft losing a little bit of market share. I don't think it's quite as dire as maybe the media or investors, make it out if you look at the market caps. But that 50-50 does seem to mean, maybe more competition. What else what else is it like to be a driver right now in LATAM, Mexico City?
I mean,
Is it a
literally
good
drivers
job?
here. Yeah, it's a good job. It
Hmm.
generates very good earnings, especially in the three big cities in Mexico, which are Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey.
Hmm.
And it's also very good year so far because again, in the three cities, competition is very fierce between the two companies. So both companies are going with very aggressive take rates, capping it at almost 20%,
Mm.
very aggressive driver engagement incentives. So they always have incentives available. And usually that translates into a good time to be a driver here in Mexico, which
Got it.
is what actually we're capitalizing here in MI NAVE and VGM in Mexico.
Very cool. How much are drivers making, on average, if let's say they're a full-time 40-hour a week driver? And is this a hard job to get signed
No,
up
I
for?
think it's not a hard job compared to what I've seen in the US. Signing up and becoming a driver, there's
Hmm.
less barriers to become a driver here in
Hmm.
Mexico.
What's it
Obviously,
like?
you need to upload around 4 or 5 documents in order
Hmm.
to become a driver. Documents that are not hard to get.
Yeah.
You need your personal
Hmm.
driver's license, your personal ID, and some other stuff like insurance. And after that, you're pretty much good to go. Here in Mexico, there's no cap in the amount of drivers
Got it.
a certain city has. So it's a free for all.
Mm. Got it. So there's no cap on the number of drivers from both Uber. This is one complaint we hear from drivers in the United States right now, that there is an oversupply, maybe partly because of macro conditions. Also, partly, I think it's, a very good, flexible job, right? So a lot of people like to earn, with no boss and on their own schedule and, cash out money. And so that, means if a lot of, if it's easy to get in, right? That's good when you're getting in, but then it means a lot of people might join. No cap on the number of drivers in Mexico City. What about the vehicle requirements? I know in international markets, typically, the percent of people that own a vehicle is very low compared to the United States. That might be perfect that we have you on, since I believe that's what you guys do at MI NAVE, right?
Yeah, so vehicle acquisition, I think if you had asked me this question 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I would have
Hmm.
told you vehicle acquisition is extremely hard.
Mm.
But over the last 3 years, that has relaxed. And over the last year, getting a vehicle has been very easy, I would say. The other point about vehicles is Uber and Didi, they're both doing the same thing. They're both since they're so desperate for drivers and supply, they're increasing the flexibility of their funnel of cars in the app. So what does this mean? They are increasing the amount of years that a car, of how old a car is in order for it to drive or enter into the app. This has been basically because the desperation for supply and the desperation to gain market share in the cities.
Interesting. So it sounds like the market is actually undersupplied right now, right?
Yes,
the companies are desperate for drivers. They're competing. They're loosening the vehicle requirements. And I have to say, I got into some pretty rough Ubers when I was in Mexico City a few years ago. I can only imagine if it gets even looser, what vehicles. That was one of the reasons I had the GM from Beat Tesla on my podcast, because the experience of riding in a Tesla in Mexico City was like, so nice already. And then compared to like the average Uber, it was like 10x, to me. But yeah, that's interesting that they're kind of loosening.
Yeah, right now, as of right now, the funnels for both Uber and Didi, the car needs to be no more than 10 years old. But this is my opinion. Also, a car that is 9 years old, should it be in the app? It's a good question.
Yeah.
But yeah, the age.
Well, I think it depends, 10 years, but not a lot of miles is probably okay. But, 6 years and driven 100,000 miles a year probably, might be a little rough. So yeah, I think so talk a little bit about MI NAVE and how you guys are working with the ride-hail companies. You're a vehicle provider?
Yes. So we offer a pathway for car ownership for the drivers here in Mexico. One of the biggest things from us is anyone can enter a process here in order to try to get a car. So we don't check your credit history. We don't check if you've had any or payments with the banks. Basically, you come here, you show us your ride-hailing experience. We do a small background check, and then we offer you the vehicle in one day. Like literally, you come here in the morning with your documents, and by the end of the day, if everything goes well, you're going to go with a vehicle and you're going to be driving in Uber or Didi by the end of the day. So that's a big win for us here in Mexico.
I think you're doing what many companies now, they're basically underwriting based off of their work history, right? If they're reliably working with Uber and Didi. So in that case, you're only renting them if they've sort of already been driving on the platform. Is that right? Or
yes, correct.
Not if they're brand new.
We also offer opportunities for brand new drivers, and we're not close to that. But yes, at the end of the day, your chances of getting a car are much better the more experience you have.
Right. And if you're reliably working, 10, 20, 30, 40 hours a week and making money, what's sort of the ballpark cost to rent? Are they renting vehicles from you? Or you mentioned a pathway to ownership. What's the kind of typical setup that people are doing with you guys? Drivers.
So the setup is, we call it an LTO. So it's you're paying us a rent, and usually these rents are for at least a term of 36 months. And by the end of those 36 months, the car is yours.
Got it.
So it's a high rent compared to pure rent because of that LTO component. But the good news is at the end of the contract, you literally take the car, we change the plates, and it's yours.
Got it.
And for rent, the price, they asked the question about rent. Usually, as of right now, we're charging around, trying to translate to USD, it would say 150 USD a week.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely is a lot cheaper than it is to rent a car in the United States. That's for sure. Usually they're $300, $400, $500 a week. And then what's the earnings potential for drivers? I mean, I'm assuming you want people similar to here, people that have this 100 to 150 a week payment. You want them to come in, drive a lot, be ready to drive 30, 40, 50 hours a week or more, I'm guessing. And then what's their kind of earnings potential as a driver for Uber and Didi?
So from the data we have, if you commit yourself to around 5 or 6 days a week, 8, 9 hours a day, you can earn at least, I would say, 300 USD a week.
Got it.
So that's more or less the earnings potential that we've seen. One of the big pluses with us is not only do you have those earnings, But with the partnership that we have with Uber and Didi, you can also adjust your rent down. So if you do a certain amount of trips a week with either Uber or Didi, you would have a rent adjustment you have to pay weekly.
Got it. Very cool. So the earnings potential definitely a bit lower than in the United States, but as long as they're kind of putting in 40 to 50 hours a week, this is a good gig for them.
And at the end of the day, I think we had a small stop, but yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, yes, it's less earnings potential, but you also have to consider the cost of living here in Mexico is much cheaper than other places in the world.
Definitely. Got it. Anything else you want to talk about in terms of Uber versus Didi or MI NAVE before I move on to maybe InDrive?
What else I would say? I mean, just the only comment I would add is this is happening in Mexico, but it's happening in the rest of Latin America as well. Mainly, I would say in Colombia and Brazil. Brazil, it's an even bigger market than Mexico. So right now, actually, Didi is not named Didi over there. It's called 99. And the battle for market share lead, it's even more intense, I would say, even in Brazil. It's even crazier than in Mexico.
Oh, really? Why is that? Yeah.
Brazil, it's a humongous market because of the population, the amount of cities, the amount of potential growth there. It's super intense compared to Mexico. So yeah, definitely one of the other priorities for Uber and Didi is growth in Brazil as well.
Got it. So they're sort of having a bit of a battle in Brazil right now, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's more or less the same story as in Mexico. It's a 50-50 battle where also take rates are super aggressive, 10 to 20%. Driver engagement incentives are super aggressive. So yes, another fight of what ride sharing going on in Brazil.
Very cool. Anything else you think might be interesting about the LATAM market or Mexico or Brazil to our audience?
Oh, I think my message here is competition is always going to drive a better experience for both drivers and passengers. I mean, one of the biggest fears we had in Didi is if Uber continues to gain market share in the US, it means it will have to have less investment in the US. It will become a cash cow per se for the company, and then they will be able to invest more aggressively in other markets, such as Mexico and Brazil.
I think that's kind of my theory as to what's happening right now. Like, I don't see how they're not making a ton of money in the United States right now. And then, like their earnings aren't that great. So I feel like they've got to be making some money and reinvesting it elsewhere. I mean, it seems like these are probably, to Mexico City, Brazil, and maybe the rest of LATAM seems like a pretty good opportunity for them to invest, right? Because Didi doesn't have that cash cow, do they?
Yeah, they do. China. I mean, China is the biggest. They are pretty much, I mean, the numbers I've heard is that they have like 90% market share in China. So you can imagine how much money they generate.
Yeah. Okay. So it might be kind of a pretty fair heavyweight battle then in LATAM for the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. So there's one other company I wanted to ask you about because they recently launched in the United States, and that is InDrive. So talk to me a little bit about them, because I remember when they came onto the scene, I think they might have had the tagline that they were the biggest rideshare company in the world, or, up there, top 1, top 2, top 3, some stat like that. And I was like, wow, I've never heard of them. But I think they're pretty big, in some LATAM type markets and other places. So tell us a little bit about InDrive and what do you know about them?
Yeah, so InDrive is a new player. I'm gonna quote that because it has been already present for about 3 to 4 years. It definitely came into the Latin American market and it created some noise, and it's actually changing market dynamics here in Mexico. The time InDrive arrived here in Mexico was during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, they did various things in order to gain market share. One important thing to mention about InDrive compared to Uber and Didi is first, they offer the negotiation. So they don't have the dispatch model that Uber and Didi uses. So the way they connect passengers as drivers is completely different. Another important thing that they offer is whenever they launch in a city, they usually go very aggressive on the regulatory side. So they live on the edge of the knife per se. So what does that mean is they usually launch in cities and they don't launch with a permit in order to operate in the city. They usually are much more lenient in their driver and passenger funnel. So you have to upload less documents, you don't have to pay taxes, etc. And the other very important thing is, especially in LATAM, it's a cash-only app, which might be kind of shocking for the US, given how informal their economy is. But here in Mexico, I mean, it's still, in the rest of Latin America, it's still not a very formal economy, and most of ride sharing is done through cash instead of card. So that
can you pay cash for Uber and Didi rides also?
Yeah, you can. In fact, I would ask you, Hera, what do you think is the percentage of cash and card payment here in Mexico for riding?
Oh, well, you sort of hinted at it, so I might guess more aggressively that I might have guessed 50-50, but now that you mentioned, I might say 70% cash and 30%, credit card payments. Like when I was in Mexico City, right, I paid for everything with my credit card linked to my Uber account.
Yeah, but you're not far away. That number you just gave me, it's pretty close to what reality is.
70-30?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which is kind of shocking if you talk with someone in the US, they would be like, I've never paid for cash.
Well, what does that mean for the ride hail sort of system or marketplace? I mean, one thing that comes to mind is security issues, right? If drivers are rolling around with lots of cash, you can call them to your house or to a dangerous area. I imagine that. And I think I've seen, we had the founders of Stop Club, which is a big app in Brazil. I forgot to mention them to you. And I know that security feature of their app was a big thing because so many people are paying for rides in cash in Brazil. So what are some, I guess, positives and negatives about that cash aspect of the ride hail system in LATAM?
So the positives is, as a driver, you get more liquidity. So
good point.
If you need gas, if you need anything for your day-to-day costs, you're going to have liquidity on demand. And the negatives obviously are safety. So you're carrying around an important amount of cash, what you've earned through the day. So that obviously is not that good on the safety side of things. In fact, Uber here in Mexico just launched a new option, like about 3 to 4 months ago, where drivers can opt in for only credit payments, which is a great option for safety. But the counter for that is you're going to get less pings and less demand. So it's one or the other. You either want more demand or you want more safety as a driver.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because I could sort of see maybe some strategies for drivers, maybe at the end of the day, they switch to credit card payments only, right? So they're not like rolling around with lots of money and, end of the night, fares are getting more, maybe it gets dark, even less safe, right? So I bet that's kind of a nice opt-in feature. And, the most popular Uber driver product they've ever released, and I guess I'll have to qualify it now in the United States, I would say is Instant Pay, right? Which allows drivers to cash out instantly at the end of every trip or every day. That liquidity aspect that you mentioned, I think that's actually a pretty big positive of cash rides, right? They still, everything is tracked. So I'm guessing you can't really avoid taxes. How people like to be paid in cash sometimes so they can avoid taxes. That might not be a benefit or, a quote unquote benefit here. But that liquidity, I think, is important, right? To drivers, or I know it's important to drivers.
Yeah. And it's so important that for some drivers, they literally only drive for InDrive because of that. They want liquidity. They don't want card payments. So for some drivers, that is one of the big advantages that the InDriver has compared to Uber and Didi.
Interesting.
And the other main point for InDriver that has allowed it to grow is that they've been very aggressive with driver earnings. What I mean by that is in almost every city in Mexico for InDrive, their take rate is around 10 to 11%. That sounds very low, but that's actually what it is. It's very transparent. Whatever the pack pays, only 10 to 11% of the trip is taken by InDrive. So on a earnings standpoint, it's definitely super attractive.
What do you think?
Downside? Oh, go ahead.
No, keep going.
The only downside I would say is per trip, it makes all the sense in the world to go with InDrive. The downside is they need more passengers in order
Yeah.
for the product itself to be absolutely a winner over Uber and Didi.
What kind of market share does InDrive have right now in the region or some of the markets where they're doing well?
I mean, it's a tricky question because they've been very successful in the small cities of Mexico. So the smaller the city, the more relevant they are. There are some small cities in Mexico where they are the kings of market share. They are the number one player in the market. And Uber already forgot about that city. It's very common. But in the major cities, such as the big three, Mexico City, Guadalajara, Monterrey, I mean, their market share could be something between 5 to 15%, which is not a market leader, but it's still a very relevant third position.
Yeah, I mean, it's not bad. I mean, there might be, certain types of trips or certain types of rides or situations where, they make sense. And I mean, what do you think about the negotiation model that they're bringing? Because I think maybe you could explain that and then kind of give us your thoughts on it.
Right. So the negotiation model, which was already copied by both Uber and Didi, more on that later,
All right.
is basically as a passenger, you select the route you want to go to, you offer your price, and then
InDrives, do they give you a suggested price though, or is it completely up to you?
Yes, but it's a very low suggested.
Got it.
And then as you post your price, all the drivers that are around the area you posted the trip will get a notification of that trip, and then they can counter with a higher price or accept the price that you offer.
Got it.
It's a bit tricky because as a driver, you're fighting or auctioning against other drivers in the same area.
Right.
So you might have a different perspective as a driver and what you want to charge by mile/kilometer. And there might be another driver that is willing to accept a lower price. So that's one of the trickiest things about the negotiation.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is what I was curious to ask you, because there's a lot of different factors. Like I could see in a supply constrained market, right? Sort of like what you talked about. Hey, drivers are in high demand right now. Like they're probably going to say no to a lot of the trips on InDrive if it's not enough, or they're going to counter with high prices, right? But at the same time, I think this is one thing Uber is doing a lot more. They're pushing a feature in the US called Trip Radar, which is very similar. It's kind of like a dispatch system, very similar to this. And it's not a negotiation, but instead of like sending you a trip offer, it's like, hey, look at these offers. Do you want to take any of these? Kind of the same concept, right? Because I think when you start doing enough volume and density, there's a lot of trips, like maybe you're more comfortable on this side of the town. Maybe you see it's a female passenger or a male passenger. Maybe you're willing, maybe you like short trips. Maybe you like long trips. There's so many of these driver preferences that are really hard to account for when you're just sending trips to drivers. And I think that I think the theory is that, from these rideshare companies is that drivers might be willing to take a haircut. They might actually be willing to, normally they want a $10 trip. They might actually take this trip for only $8 if it meets one of those criteria that they care about. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that in terms of the negotiation model.
No, actually, the Trip Radar is also present here in both Uber and Didi. It's also another feature that was launched less than a year ago. And the feedback I've always received from the drivers, and when you're using either the Trip Radar from Uber or Didi, is they use it as a complement whenever they're not getting any trips they want. So if they want to go to a certain part of the city and it's not that well paid, they can look at the Trip Radar, see if anything's good. I'll use it as a sort of trip to move to the direction I want.
Got it. Like they want to reposition anyways, like, okay, I'll take this. Or, it's slow in the area they're in. Look at Trip Radar. Oh, this will take me to another part of town where it might be busier.
Yeah. And the other important thing regarding the trip negotiation model is both Uber and Didi, the impact of InDrive was so big that now Uber and Didi have a negotiation product as well.
How does that work?
So in Uber, it's called Uber Acuerdo. So Uber agreement, that's translation. And in Didi, it's called Didi Pon Tu Precio. So Didi set your fare, pretty much. Uber is testing it in around 12 to 13 cities in Mexico. So that product is still not available in the 3 big cities, but they already looking into it. So it's already being tested in Latin America. Will that ever move to the US? I do not know. Who knows? But it's already being tested in Latin America. And in Didi, it's already being tested in the the big cities. So it's
Got it.
already present here as well. And basically, it's at the end of the day, the decision is on the passenger. The passenger either chooses the traditional UberX or Didi Express trip, or you have the option of also negotiating your fare as well.
Got it. So is it sort of a separate category, UberX, Uber
Yeah.
Black, Uber Negotiate? Is it like its own
Pretty
category
much
if you want to
that's how it
negotiate with a
works.
driver? Interesting.
Yeah, that's how it works. It's like an extra product added to the app.
Who do you think it benefits most? Customers or drivers or companies, that model?
I think it's a good benefit from both perspectives, but depending on what each one is looking for. So one of the big things we've seen of the negotiation model is it offers more flexibility, absolutely 100%.
Yeah.
It offers more flexibility for the drivers. You can now absolutely choose your trips. You don't have to worry about acceptance rate. You don't have to worry about what trips you want or not want. You can move to wherever you want in the city. But on the other side is you're gonna spend more time on the app negotiating with pets.
Yeah.
So that's a big plus, that negative, that you're gonna have more downtime because you're gonna be negotiating on the app. So yes, there's more flexibility, but at the cost that you'll probably spend more time negotiating with passengers.
Got it.
And on the passenger side, there's definitely a price advantage. If you are very, very price sensitive, I mean, you can spend 30 minutes negotiating prices if you want.
Yeah.
And on the other side, if you are absolutely desperate to get somewhere, you can offer 2x or 3x the price that you don't really offer, and you're going to get a driver instantly that is going to come for you.
Yeah.
So it obviously offers more flexibility, but it's also going to offer more inconsistencies in your earnings as well.
Yeah, I feel like I still need to, I don't know, I'm not, I feel like I need to see it more in action, learn more about it, because I think there's something there too with the, emerging markets, like outside of the US, whenever we travel to other countries, Southeast Asia, LATAM, everything's a negotiation, right? Nothing is list price. Like in America, it's you pay what you can always negotiate a little, but like you're not going in places and I think there's also sometimes culturally, it's kind of people like to negotiate, right? Oh, you feel like you got a deal. So I think that'll definitely be a model to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I don't know if we'll ever get to the US, but it's definitely something that is growing here in Latin America.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I feel like we hit on a lot. I know there was one other area, regulation that you had mentioned. I don't know if you want to give a quick update or if there's anything you want to say, but we can kind of end on that note if that sounds good.
Yeah, so regulatory, and I feel like regulatory operations and the whole ecosystem here in Latin America is always one step behind the US for obvious reasons. I mean, it makes all the sense of the world.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's still a very unexplored area. The only country here in Latin America that has taken steps in order to regulate drivers and the apps themselves is Chile. So Chile is the first one to do sort of a hybrid model in which drivers are not considered full-time employees, but they've pushed the companies to say they're not full-time employees, but you do have to give them some sort of benefits. So I think that's at the end of the day what both all ride-hailing companies are looking for. A hybrid model. They know they cannot remain unregulated at zero for the near future. They need to reach a compromise. And from what I've seen is, let's reach a middle point between we don't want full-time employees, but we do accept we have to give them some benefits. We cannot.
Sounds pretty similar to the United States, where there's sort of some form of compromise happening in a lot of these places.
Yeah. And I mean, here in Latin America, everyone has their eyes on Minnesota and what's happening. It's literally, I mean, it's
good old Minnesota.
US only topic, but everyone's looking at what's happening there because it's obviously, if it happens in one city, it can probably happen in not other cities as well, but other countries as well.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, Charlie, really appreciate you coming on and giving us all the insight into Didi, Uber, InDrive. Mexico City, Brazil, even a little Chile there at the end. And so folks want to learn more, learn more about you, maybe MiNav, we can leave a link in the show notes, but where can they find you or follow you or see what everything you're up to?
Yeah, so you can add me on my LinkedIn page. I'll add it. I'll pass it to you so
Cool.
your viewers and listeners can add it. And yeah, mostly talk about ride sharing, obviously, in my profile.
Yeah.
And if you want to see what's happening on Latin America, give me a shout out and we can talk.
You're the guy.
Very passionate about the business.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about either of the three companies, what is happening over here, just let me know.
And I guess if anyone's ready to give Uber or Didi a spin as a driver in LATAM, they can go to MiNav too, right?
Yes, as well. We'll get you here for process and we'll see that you end up with a car by the end of the day.
Boom. Very cool. Awesome. Appreciate it, Charlie.
All right. Thank you very much, Harry.
Thanks for watching today's episode of the RideShare Guy podcast. For more information on today's guest, please check the description. Now, you don't want to miss this interview of the RideShare Guy podcast, so click here and also make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future ones. See you next time.